All right. Well, good afternoon, or maybe good morning if we have any folks from our global campuses. My name is Taj Smith, and I serve as the Director of Diversity Education at RIT in the Rochester campus. And I'll be serving as today's host for our program, What's Your Diversity? And so today we have at least two guests. I'm expecting a potential third, but at least two guests who are going to talk a little bit about their personal and professional lives as it relates to diversity, inclusion, and equity. So just as a quick reminder, we usually have a set of questions we ask those folks, and that usually takes up the first 30 minutes or so. And then after that time, we'll then turn it over to the audience for you to ask questions of our guest storytellers. Again, you can use the chat to ask your question. You can unmute yourself and use your voice to do so, or you can get the attention of our interpreters and we can have your thoughts communicated in sign language. All right. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and begin, and I'm going to ask Barbara just to quickly start us off by introducing yourself, and then we'll have Tiffany follow.
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Barbara Contreras. I am the Assistant Director of Diversity Initiatives over at the Computing Science College, so at Golisano. Should I say where I'm from? I should have asked you this, Tosh. Okay, so I'm originally from Venezuela, but I grew up in the States, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in some of the questions.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Tiffany Brodner. I use she, her pronouns. I work as the Associate Director for Building Operations in the Center for Campus Life, which is part of the Division of Student Affairs. I've been at RIT for over a year. The work I really do in the facility with building management is more than just making sure that the facility is kept. It's about making sure that no matter who you are, or background or lived experience, that you feel welcomed in our spaces. I'm excited to be a part of this today.
All right, well, thank you both. All right, so our first question that I'm gonna ask of you is, could you tell us a little bit about home? Now, I recognize home can be an easy subject for some people to discuss, and home can be a complicated subject. So I'll allow you to define home as you wish and share what you wanna share. But if you could tell us a little bit about home, and if that's different than your current environment where you live, just kind of give us an idea of, how is it different, in any way you want to explain that.
I can go first. Like I said, I'm originally from Venezuela. My parents and I moved to the States when I was 8 years old. So I don't always define home as Venezuela. I think as I've gotten older, I've kind of moved away from that, just because that's not where I lived most of my life, right? So I define home as if it's a physical place. If I have to define it, when people ask me where I'm from, I say Hilton Head. That's where I grew up. So I grew up in a tiny little island called Hilton Head, South Carolina. It's 10 miles long. It's very small. It's a very touristy spot if you've ever been. It's very fancy. A lot of country club kind of places. But I think, what I think about home is really my parents. I'm very close to them. I think my biggest, I think in this question, we also got asked, what is our fondest memory? And I think it's just sitting with my parents at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, eating a traditional Venezuelan breakfast, which is arepas, which are our flour cakes. I always say it's the Venezuelan tortilla. It's not flat like our tortilla, you have to slice it. I should have gotten a picture of it. And then I'm from the Andes regions of Venezuela, so we actually eat a potato soup for breakfast because it's cold. It's not cold like here. And it's not a creamy potato soup like American potato soup. It's more a broth with potatoes. So that's like what I like feel like home, and like that's where I find my comfort. And like even when we visit home now, like always like driving into Hilton Head, you have to go over a bridge, and just like I always like put the windows down and like smell the marsh, and like that just makes me feel really, yeah, I don't know, it makes me feel welcome. I guess it's just because I don't live by the ocean anymore, so that just like brings that. And then I think it's really different. I moved to Rochester last August. It was my first time ever dealing with snow. Before living in Rochester, I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for 10 years. So that's just also so different. Yeah, and then I would also say like I like live, like we own our own home, me and my husband, and I live in Pittsburgh, so that's really different. I grew up in like a very Hilton Head, even though like it is predominantly white. It has like a very large Latin American community. And like I can go to like mass, like Catholic mass in Spanish, and that's not something that like I have in my local community here now. And like my parents like still rent their apartment, so like I always feel like some sort of guilt because I feel like my parents should own their own place and I am the one that owns my own place. So those are like things that are like majorly different.
Thank you.
For me, I feel really privileged to find it really comforting to talk about home. All of my grandparents on both sides were from Puerto Rico, born there. We moved to the New York City, Brooklyn specifically, area when they were all fairly young. They came with their families and they settled in the same areas. And my parents grew up surrounded by families from both sides. And that family and togetherness value is super ingrained. And I was fortunate to grow up in the same way, in that same area that both of those sides of the family settled. I grew up surrounded by 3 generations of family in each other's space with celebrations and pop-up visits and all the good and bad that comes with everyone knowing everything about everyone. But home for me is being with the people that I love. So I grew up in Brooklyn, and it's an area in Brooklyn that is right across the river from Manhattan. So just 2 train stops away. So I could see the skyline perfectly with just a short walk to one of the areas that we referred to as the Heights. I have fond memories with my siblings going to Coney Island and eating Nathan's hot dogs and traveling in long car rides to visit family in Long Island. I now know a long car ride to be more than 6 hours. And I think from Brooklyn to Long Island, depending on where you're going, it's maybe 45 to an hour. We would also listen to Hot 97 and learn the words to songs that we probably should not have been singing. But those are some of my fondest memories there. At 17, I moved away from my Brooklyn home to SUNY Brockport to start college and felt very far from home. Having never even been to summer camp, that transition was very difficult. I was also, attending a predominantly white institution, and I was one of the then 3% of underrepresented populations attending. I did find a home there, and I found it with fellow EOP students, and I found it with counselors who took special interest in me and my success. Some of those relationships that I found there are still existing in my life today, and the most meaningful one being the one I made with my partner, who's also an EOP student. I never thought I would call the Rochester area home, but with a partner from the area and finding success in our careers here, we very much call Rochester home now. And this year, I am equal time living in Brooklyn and living in Rochester. So it's kind of like a funky experience to know that moving forward, I will have lived in Rochester for longer than I lived in Brooklyn. But my physical home these days is filled with stuffed animals and Nintendo Switch and stepping on Legos and endless cuddles and snuggles from my 7 and 2-year-old boys. Home is just off campus. I could walk. which has been really convenient. It allows me to spend more time with my family. I have convinced my sister and my best friend from Rockport to move to Rochester. And we have slowly started to build that family unit that I grew up around, kind of settling in that same area. Going back to Brooklyn these days is a little bit more challenging with little ones, but when I do go, I do not recognize the place that I grew up. Gentrification has really changed the area. And Sammy from the corner store who would hand me my bacon, egg, and cheese is now replaced with like Ethan Hawke, who is a neighbor on the street. So again, long gone is a place that I knew. But as long as my people are there, that's really what I consider home.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. And Tiffany, really quick, you brought me back to a relating point as I grew up in northern New Jersey, so I know Hot 97. All right. So my next question is, how do you define diversity? And if that definition has changed or grown over your lifetime, just kind of share, what that has meant.
Yeah, I think that I probably didn't really even know what diversity was until probably graduated college. I, like Tiffany, also went to a predominantly white school. There's 5,000 kids, only 25 of us are Latinos. So I'm not sure that I knew a definition, so I don't know if it's changed over time. I think right now, especially being in this space, how I define diversity is celebrating one's uniqueness. That could be like ethnicity and culture, gender and sexual orientation, right? So that's how I defined it now.
Barbara, I cannot relate more in being super late to the game and kind of recognizing diversity as diversity. So for me now, diversity is to me, it's representation of our parts, our identities, backgrounds, our talents, our differences, our lived experiences, our abilities, all the things that we bring to the table that make us who we are and determine how we can contribute to a team. Again, super late. In my New York City bubble and being under 17, I was privileged enough to understand difference and embrace difference, but really never giving it a second thought simply because it's just the way things were. People from all over the world who looked very different with all different types of abilities and experiences were all just New Yorkers in my eyes. It wasn't until I was in college and feeling different that it became crystal clear how without some intentional efforts, being different could be painful. But now I see it as a part of a puzzle combined with inclusion and equity, and I think education and willingness to learn about those three that really get us closer to a sense of belonging, and could really, that combination could really bring the community to its fullest potential.
Thank you both, appreciate that. So now we want to think about, how does diversity show up in your professional and or personal lives? And both of you kind of, touched on a little bit of that. So if you want to elaborate in some areas, but how does diversity show up or influence or impact your professional or personal life?
Yeah, so I'm not only like Latina, I'm also an immigrant to this country. So there's a lot of differences. I think that not even just from Tiffany living in like New York and surrounded by her family, but like just the difference I'll have to go through because I wasn't born in the US, right? There's this like great quote that I always go back to. So if you've ever watched the movie Selena, the J-Lo Selena, so there's a moment where Selena's dad, Selena's young at this point, is explaining to her like what it was like for him to be a performer in the US as a Mexican. And he says this thing where like I so relate to it. It's like you have to be more Mexicans than the Mexicans, and you have to be more Americans than the Americans. And it's this, and I see Stella's also shaking her head like, yes. It's just like this moment where like, I mean, I've watched this movie a lot, but like, I think one of the times when I heard it and it just clicked of like, for me to like this line of like, I'm not fully like Hispanic, because like I was born there, but like I was raised here from a very young age in a predominantly white area. And like, I'm not really American because like my passport doesn't say so, and like I don't look like it, right? It's just like this struggle of like how to morph yourself when you're in those situations and never fully feeling like you belong in either one. I think that's something that like I personally like still struggle with. Like I guess I speak Spanish and that was my first language, but like I'm not around it as much anymore. So there is times where like I Spanglish it. And so that can be sometimes like daunting, like speaking to a crowd of like Hispanics, or just like feeling like out of place because I can't like articulate myself as much as I would want to. And that, yeah, I mean, like you can, one of the reasons that I never changed my last name when I got married was like, I felt like I would lose that heritage and like on paper, you can immediately tell who I am, right? If I changed my last name to Overgore when I showed up, it would be like, who is this lady? And then I think professionally, it's given me a uniqueness, right? Like I bring something different to the table, especially like in the line of work that I'm in now of like trying to create spaces for students of color and trying to get, you know, more of a voice for those students. I know that my students kind of know to relate to me because I have been in those spots, right? And I know students can be really real with me because they're like, oh, she gets it, like she looks like me. So I think that has helped professionally. There was like a moment in my life where I definitely felt that it was a hinder. So I'm not only like an immigrant, but I am a DACA recipient. So like telling that to people is really hard because there's a lot of other questions that come with it about what my family's immigration status is. Or like trying to explain that to an HR person when I go to give them my documentation. There's a job interview years ago where I was very upfront with it, and I was kind of like a shoo-in, and I was pretty sure that I was getting the job, and I know it changed after I was transparent about it. It made me feel like so really self-conscious and like ashamed of who I was, and I think like, yeah, I feel that sometimes just in my personal life too. So, and that was the only moment that I've ever felt like professionally it's been a hinder. But now I think about it more as something that I have to embrace. It's also something that I think like people don't know about. So like I now like to share it so that they can ask questions and knowing that the uncomfortable will come, but that's just part of who I am and just like, yeah, just like really loving myself for it.
I relate a ton to that. And I think, Barbara, the spaces that you're creating for students are the spaces that I seeked out as a student. So in college, I was lucky enough to find some of those meaningful mentors that I mentioned earlier. I saw these women, also Latinas, who were some of my EOP counselors and had the way they moved through the political jungle gym with grace was just so impressive to me. I saw how they had conversations, how they advocated with confidence, how they cared about me as a person. And in the background, they were vulnerable enough with me to share that it didn't always feel super good in those moments, but that the work was important. So anytime anyone would question my ability, I was kind of encouraged by them to kind of persevere. I remember one specific time sitting in a professor's office feeling defeated, and him sharing that, I mean, quite bluntly, that he did not think I was cut out for the work. And my background at that point, I was an undergrad and was studying communication studies with a minor in recreation and leisure management. So it was my final semester. To get this blow from a professor was hard. And he was being less than encouraging. And in that moment, the chair of the department, Dr. Joel Frater, walked by, super strong department chair, and ultimately moved on to be the diversity representative for the college before these positions were truly created at institutions. And he was a man from Jamaica and had a presence about him. And he stopped in his tracks. And, he since has shared with me that he stopped because he recognized my expression as one that he has felt in some of those settings that were less supportive. And he walked right into that office. It was one of his, professors that he was leading as a department chair, and talked to me, introduced himself to me, asked if I would consider the graduate program after a super quick discussion about my goals and hopes for my life in, the recreation field. The other professor sat in silence. In the 5 minutes that he sat and talked to me, I felt seen, I felt encouraged, I felt like I can be brave to try something new. And I threw my name in the hat, and did pretty well, got into the program and did pretty well in the program. That interaction for me changed a ton. So while I wasn't initially trying to get into higher education, I was really heading toward that recreation world. With a graduate assistantship in campus life, it is the work that kind of pulled at me. But it was a staff member who made that connection with me and made me feel like I could, again, be seen and respected. So as a professional now and working with students, it's the experiences that I try and create for my students, right? So stopping them in the hallway to introducing myself. I haven't seen you around these parts. Like, who are you? What are you about? Where's home? I hired the welcome desk team, which is an incredibly diverse team of students who sit at the front desk of the campus center, right? I want folks to walk into that building and see themselves represented in some of the staff that are there. As a professional, I have definitely been asked to sit at tables that I know, I'm pretty confident I was asked to sit at these tables because I could fulfill a checkbox. And that used to cause me a great deal of stress in the beginning, but now I definitely see it as an opportunity that I have something to offer. And if you put me at a table, please know that I'm going to use that opportunity. I'm going to invite other people with me. And eventually you'll either stop asking me to fill your quota, or you'll see that I have something more to offer and keep asking me to come back.
Thank you both. All right, so my last question that I have, so to signal to our audience members to get your questions ready. And as a reminder, you can use the chat, you can type it in and I can state it on your behalf. You could unmute yourself and use your voice to communicate, or you can get the attention of our interpreters so we can have your thoughts communicated. So my last question has to do with recommendations. Could you share with us any recommendations for us to continue our learning around diversity broadly, or specifically around identities that are near and dear to you that you feel are useful resources? So those can be YouTube, streaming shows, cultural activities such as dancing or attending a performance of some kind, podcasts, a book, anything that you think would be helpful to encourage people's learning.
I have a list. I can share it in the chat afterwards too. So I thought of just general things that I would recommend to someone just to that I always felt myself represented. And I think there's quite a bit of like a movement to have more representation of diverse groups now. I would also say like my two favorite shows where I felt really represented in have also been canceled, which I hate, but you can go back and watch the other episodes. So my number one is Gentrified. It's on Netflix. It just had 2 seasons. It just got canceled. It's about a family in LA, a Mexican family in LA, and they have like multiple generations. But there was an episode that just like really hit home. Also Party of Five. I think this was like a reboot on ABC Family that I think is now called Freedom. It was really good. It was about an immigrant family and kind of the struggles of having children that are DACA and children that are born in the US and being parents, undocumented parents. And that just really hits home. And then I think like some fun, like funny shows that also bring in some hard topics, Mr. Iglesias, which is also on Netflix. It hits some like really difficult topics of being an immigrant in the US, but in like a funny way. And then I would say books. I really loved Finding Latinx. It is, I would say like almost like a documentary in a book. It goes through the whole entire US, and this reporter kind of interviews different types of people that you would find in these pockets. Actually, I know someone that got interviewed for the book, so that's really cool. And then I would say American Like Me. It's a short story book. And then American Dirt. I really identified with it. I know there's like a little bit of controversy about it because it's written from a white woman, but it is really good. I actually got it from my mom in Spanish, and she like ate it up in like 48 hours. She just really identified with the story. And then podcasts, if you know Spanish, there's 2 podcasts that are called Radio Volante and El Hilo. There's social cultural podcasts about just stories happening in Latin America that you don't always see on the news, and they're especially pointed out for like American audience that speaks Spanish. But they actually made an app that's called Lupa, which is like magnifying glass in Spanish. And what they do is they take the stories that they have on these podcasts and they translate them, but it's a way for you to learn Spanish. So it's like a really unique way to learn like the native language. A lot of like, I think any of us can relate to that struggle of learning a second language. You get taught like the very proper way. But this is like taking stories that are interesting and trying to then teach you Spanish with them. I think that's it.
Great. Fabulous list. I'm gonna pause for a second and let the interpreter switch. All right, thank you. So yeah, Barbara, definitely if you could type some of that up in the chat, especially some of the Spanish words so we get the right spelling.
Yes.
All right.
That list is amazing. Mine definitely I had at least 2 of those on there, that gentrified piece and the book, the first book you mentioned. So those are all super wonderful. I have been sharing, I have, the children who take up my every moment of free time. So what I've been sharing with them, we have watched the Disney Encanto about 70 times, probably like this week and last week alone. So I can't tell you how many times overall, but I thought Disney did a pretty good job at representation of culture in there. And there's always opportunities to be better, but I thought overall it was pretty good. And we also recently watched West Side Story and In the Heights, and those are super, again, pop culture, but I think there is a much more concerted effort to show these stories on the big screen, which is really pleasing to see. I think On campus specifically, we have a ton of resources, whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion, our spirituality and religious life, all of the opportunities we have to try and learn sign language and so much more. But I did want to highlight that if you are inclined to tell your story, if you are not finding the representation that you see, to be brave to build something on your own. I have a friend who works for RIT as well, Nikki Matthews. She's over at CET, and she had done a birthday party for her son. It was a baby shower, expecting 2 other boys, so 3 boys total. And the centerpieces were going to be books and children's stories with Black and brown babies as the focus of the story. And it was really difficult to find that representation at the number that we were looking for. And she wrote a book. She wrote a children's book. It's called The Truth About Me. And she has more books coming to try and, share the story, a story that Black and brown boys can relate to. So if you're not finding something, if you're not finding your story shared in there, I absolutely encourage you to go ahead and take the leap and create that.
Thank you so much. And if you could also, type some of those suggestions, but just to echo your point about if you don't find something and you have the ability, to create it, definitely, I think that's a helpful tip. Also, somewhat plug, it's not a plug for myself, but a plug related to the diversity in children books. We do have, a local resource here in Rochester, Hippocampal, which is owned, I believe, by 2 Puerto Rican owners. I don't frequent as much because I don't have children, but I have been there, and they're in the South Wedge neighborhood. So they do a wonderful job of making sure there are books, Spanish, but also representative of different identities. All right, so with that said, now is the time to really open it up to our audience and see if you have any questions you'd like to ask of Tiffany or Barbara. Again, you can use the chat to share that, and I can state it on your behalf, or you can state it on your own behalf.
Hi, this is Stella speaking. Thank you, Tiff and Barbara. That was great. Barbara, I love the movie Selena. I used to watch it all the time. So when you quote it, it brought me back. I also didn't change my last name because my husband's last name is DeSalvo. And I said, if I go in as Stella DeSalvo, they're going to be very, very confused. But Tiff, you talked about it more, but Barbara, you could also answer as well of how, that awful situation with your professor, which I think unfortunately is something that a lot of people of color, especially women of color, face, unfortunately. And Barbara, you kind of talked about, the Selena example of you having to be more of something and more American just because our acceptance is conditional on kind of how much we prove ourselves. So I wanted to know in that kind of line of thinking, because that made me think of imposter syndrome. I still have it. I don't know if it'll ever go away, honestly. So I just want to know how Tiffany and Barbara, how you deal with imposter syndrome, or do you have any suggestions on how to overcome that, or examples, or so on and so forth?
I think I absolutely have it. And I think a lot of it for me is faking it. And that sounds awful, but I mean, I try to pump myself up. I have to do it today. I try and pump myself up by giving myself some affirmations. I have a playlist of songs that I listen to that make me feel strong and like ready to take on anything. One of them is, oddly enough, by Katy Perry. It's called Daisies, like highly recommend. It just makes me feel like I can take on anything, like no matter what anyone thinks about me, or what I think about myself, really, because that's who I'm speaking to in those moments. And I think just keep practicing that piece of it, right? And I also do, I don't remember, I think it was Shonda, right? I don't remember, who had introduced me to the Superwoman pose. And it's like standing up and like, you know, keeping your arms out. And the longer you stand in that position, the more confident you can feel throughout the day. So like before I take anything on, whether it's a challenging conversation, going to a meeting, sometimes just starting my day, right? Like brushing my teeth in the mirror, like that pose has been like, you got this, like you can do it. But I think oftentimes we're our own worst critic.
Yeah, I agree with you a lot, Tiffany, especially on we're our own worst critic. I mean, aside from my Hispanic mother. Yes, I love her and I know she loves me, but she'll always criticize me. It's okay. And it's like that little voice in the back of your head. But yeah, no, definitely I fake it until I make it. I definitely feel this way, especially sometimes in the position that I hold now. I'm not an expert on this. It's just something that's a passion of me for me, and I want to create more spaces for students that look like me because I know what Tiffany felt like. I definitely have felt like that before, and I know that I'm not the only one. I know exactly what look you were even saying yourself, right? Just like that moment of like the whole world is crashing down and why is this happening? Yeah, I meditate before I go and do something like this. I definitely have headspace. I also tend to just like word vomit on my husband about everything I feel. And I'm very lucky to be married to someone that is not like, yeah, he just doesn't believe in imposter syndrome. And so he just like pumps me up. So I think that has been really helpful. It stops the mother nagging voice in my head. But yeah, a lot of the times I do feel like I'm just faking it and just being really confident going into the room. I definitely know the Superwoman pose. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we do have a question in the chat here, which I'll read from Dominica. Do you still have family in Venezuela or Puerto Rico, respectively? If so, how do you continue to connect with family from so far, especially during COVID when it wasn't really possible to visit? For me, it feels different trying to connect with family in the US versus family abroad sometimes, for example.
So yeah, I do still have family in Venezuela. So my parents live in the US and my brother and his wife and their kids, and I have like a few other relatives, but my grandparents actually live in Venezuela. That can be really hard, especially now that they're getting older, especially during COVID times. I'm sure if you're not aware of this, if you are, Venezuela is like in a very bad political crisis. They're calling it like the Venezuelan exodus for the last few years. Pretty much if you live in Venezuela right now, you are either really, really poor because you can't get out of the country, or you're in an older age that it makes it hard for you to travel. So even just getting basic needs in Venezuela can be difficult. COVID made it even worse. There was a lot of restrictions on how much you could travel, mostly because the socialist government at the time took advantage of restricting people more. So that has been hard. I talked to my grandmother on the phone. I actually have a grandmother that is hearing impaired, which makes it more difficult to connect with her. So it's usually through a different family member. She also has dementia, so that has been difficult. I'm actually, because I have DACA, I'm not ever able to travel to Venezuela unless it's like a family emergency and I have to go through a very extensive process to do so. So I've never been to visit my family since I left. So that is really difficult. And I think that's also probably why I don't find Venezuela so much as my home as others.
Barbara, you said you have a grandmother who is hearing impaired and struggling with dementia, and I have the same situation, who still lives in Puerto Rico. She is incredibly strong-willed. If I had to guess, that's where any of us got it. It came straight down from the apple tree. But I do try and connect still. My parents go over multiple times a year. Oftentimes we're trying to bring her back with us to get her healthcare here. After Hurricane Maria, things in Puerto Rico were very, very different. The infrastructure is just really still struggling to this day, many years later. So like having that like FaceTime communication or like that video communication is difficult with some family members who understand or are willing to take technology and learn it. For my grandmother, very unwilling, but I try and call, and oftentimes I know she's really struggling to hear what I'm saying, but she knows that I'm calling and caring, and I'll listen to anything she tells me. And usually she's like, well, I'm really busy, I have to go. So that's typically when the conversations end. I've been really lucky to go to Puerto Rico a number of times in my life, and my parents used to send us there for summers, like a month at a time, in between school. I've never been to Puerto Rico as a tourist, ever. There are many tourist areas that I would love to explore, but our trips have always really been catching up with those family members. I've not been back since Maria happened, but I do look forward to going and bringing my children.
Thank you. Any other questions if people have? As we wait, Barbara or Tiffany, do you have a question for each other?
Yeah, Tiffany, what are like some good local places I should visit? Like Puerto Rican food or just any Latin food? Has been a struggle since we moved to Rochester. Charlotte was like I could literally go down the street and I had my pickings. So where can I go?
I have tried many places, and while there are many good places, there are two places that stick out to me as my opinion the best in Rochester. One is Puerto Rican food, and one I believe is like a fusion of like Cuban and Dominican food. Amazing. So the first one is El Latino, which is on Chile Ave, so not far. I think we're like exit 17 on 390 and they're exit 19.
Okay.
And the other one's a bit of a hike, but worth a day trip. It's called Borinquen, and it's in Mount Morris, which is down 390, like past Geneseo, right at the entrance of Letchworth State Park. So you can definitely make a day of seeing the beautiful landscape in Letchworth and the falls at Letchworth. And then before you come home, hit up some delicious Puerto Rican food at Borinquen.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
It's a very good question, and something that for folks all on the call, particularly if you're not as familiar with Rochester, or you don't maybe think about it, right? Unfortunately, so much of this is segregated, right? To be able to get a lot of various kinds of Latin-based food, is you have to be on the west side, right? Not on the east side, which is going to be your Pittsford, your Brighton kind of areas. Now there is a new spot that a person who has connections to RIT opened up, but that's fairly new in Brighton.
What's it called?
I'm blanking on it right now.
Are you thinking Carmen's Cooking?
Yes, thank you, thank you. We brought some students there.
I'm a big
Uh,
foodie, so usually I know.
yeah, they have RIT connections. So if you go in, they'll actually, if you mention you're from RIT, they'll give you a discount. But pretty good food. But most of that home, cooking is going to be on the west side. So that is very telling of how we structure things, here in Rochester. All right. I saw another question in the chat. What are your hopes for the future of education? It's a big question. What are your hopes for the future of education?
I can start. It's a very loaded question. I would say that, sorry, I really have to think about this. So I think that there's a difference between higher and lower education, right? Like K through or pre-K through 12 and then higher education. And we can turn our wheels up here in higher education to try to make more spaces for diverse students. But as long as we are not doing efforts to help pre-K through 12 education to make it more equal, and I use equal with quotations because there's a lot of that, like just making sure that the access is there, and also that the education is throughout the same, which I know will be very difficult, and I don't envy the job of those pre-K through 12 teachers, but as long as we have that division of like, if you live in the inner city or you come from a lower income, your education will always look different than someone of a higher income in the suburbs. I think no matter how many spaces we create in higher education, it can be really difficult to just get those students interested. I know that I was told that I had to go to college and then there's like no way out because like those are my parents. That doesn't mean that not every parent is like that, but I think like there is in communities like where you are usually the first generation, it can be really difficult to navigate the system, even just like thinking about, is college an option? I volunteered with a group of students back when I lived in Charlotte that were all Latina lower income. And I remember the first time that they even were told that college is an option for them. A lot of them just were, yeah, like that was just like a weird thing to hear because they definitely feel like there's this path, right? It's hard to break that mold. I think as higher education institutions, we can do a lot of work there by doing outreach events, especially like us here locally, making those spaces for those students, even just to get more equalized. So I think my goal, right, my dream would be that our percentage are very equal throughout whatever your racial background is, just because I know that I know the numbers, how they look like now, and it's a struggle.
I think my hopes really much, I mean, they very much mirror Barbara's. I had lived in this bubble of higher education for a while now. And once my kids started going into school, I had these just visions about school being just very different and much more up on the times and like willing to have conversations. And they're not, at least the experiences that my kids are having. I think it's definitely an area that the focus will be needed. And I think it's probably needed at different levels, depending upon what state you're in or who your policymakers are. So while I think we're heading in a time of people waking up and like wokeness is a thing, and people educating themselves, which I think is absolutely the direction we want folks to head in. I sadly think, and it's not that I'm hopeless, but I could be more hopeful that the folks who are still at the table and making those decisions aren't necessarily where they need to be. So my hope for the future of education is that people are growing up with with someone instilling in them that they don't have to accept maybe the boxes that they feel that they've been put into, and that they can try something bold and new and run for office and do something that can make a difference and try and change the different, the experiences that they've had.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up today's session as we near our time. So thank you both, Tiffany and Barbara, for being willing participants and sharing a little piece of yourselves, with us. Certainly is not an easy task that I ask and Stella asks of folks to participate in this program, but we always are greatly appreciative of what does get shared. And thank you to our audience for participating today. We do have one more What's Your Diversity session remaining in this semester before we close out. So hopefully some of you are attending that and sign up for that. And thank you to our interpreters as always. Everybody have a great day.